On March 20th, President Trump signed an executive order that drastically reduced the size of the Department of Education and began a process whereby he hoped it would finally bring about an end to the Department of Education. Now, this is controversial with some, but believe it or not, creating the Department of Education was not as popular as you might think. There were actually many opponents in 1979, not the least of which were prominent Democrats like Daniel Patrick Moynihan and even some teachers' unions like the American Federation of Teachers. It was seen as a massive federal intrusion into an issue that was better left to individuals, localities, and states. And over its 46-ish year history, the department has grown in size and budget, while test scores and other metrics that we use to monitor educational results have remained relatively flat. The department over time became a bludgeon that could be used against local school divisions by whoever happened to be holding power in the White House. And as it continued to wade into cultural war issues, such as threatening the removal of funds from local school districts that did not comply with controversial transgender policies, such as allowing boys into girls' locker rooms and sports teams, it appeared that the very worst predictions of what the department could become had actually arrived. But there is one area where many still seem to agree that the department is useful, perhaps even essential to ensuring that a quality educational environment is achieved in the United States, and that is on the question of educational studies. Because even those who agree that a bloated Department of Education should not exist often concede and sometimes even insist that there is one service provided that is still desperately needed, and that is in the area of studies. So, this sounds somewhat reasonable, but we need to assess the Department of Education's track record. There are generally two ways that the Department of Ed facilitates the conduct of studies. One is through the issuing of grants for academic research, and the other is through the Institute of Education Sciences, which is an in-house research wing of the department. So first, let's take a look at some of the studies that the Department of Education has funded. Here's one in which $1.3 million was issued as a grant from the IES to study the effects of a virtual reality penguin habitat on college students' climate change beliefs and environmental behaviors. What this did was it aimed to see if immersing students in a virtual reality penguin environment could shift their views on climate change. Or how about $260,000 spent in 2019 on a study titled Exploring the Role of Selfie Taking in Student Identity and Academic Engagement, which investigated whether or not snapping selfies could boost students' sense of belonging and motivation in school. Or how about funding studies into equity audits and conversations in Ohio schools? Then, of course, there's the Examining the Impact of Gender-Inclusive Policies on Student Outcomes, which focused on how policies like gender-neutral bathrooms ultimately affect student well-being and achievement. Now, these taxpayer-funded studies that went to outside groups in order to conduct the research have obviously raised some questions. But what about when it comes to in-house studies? Those are the ones conducted by the Institution of Education Sciences, which we need to first remember breaks down into 4 research subgroups. The first one is the National Center for Education Evaluation and Regional Assistance. Then there's the National Center for Education Research, followed by the National Center for Education Statistics, and finally the National Center for Special Education Research. Some of these in-house studies include things like navigating LGBTQI+ research, where we are and where we are headed, or exploring gender integration into classrooms, where the researchers, before they conducted their study, acknowledged that even though their research was involving 3rd to 5th grade students, they wanted to make it very clear that they understood that gender is fluid and not a binary. Now, out of curiosity, with that sort of acknowledgement, do you think that the assumptions that went into that report gave you an unbiased or objective analysis and conclusion? Or do you think maybe ideology slipped in there somewhere? But the controversies are not isolated to what we might call the left side of the ideological spectrum. For instance, during his first term in office, President Trump made a series of last-minute appointments that many on the left criticize as being partisan. But doesn't that kind of just illustrate the point that the reason why politicians want to control these appointments is because it provides them the ability to potentially push an agenda under the guise of being neutral or nonpartisan, when in reality, it's ideologically driven. But you want to know what's perhaps the most interesting conclusion here? It's those studies that were conducted by the Department of Education that found that the Department of Education wasn't achieving its objectives. Like this study completed in 2011, which studied the ability of comprehensive technical assistance centers to help schools improve performance under No Child Left Behind. The study found that while centers provided a range of services to include training, resources, and technical assistance, there was, quote, no clear evidence of a significant impact on state capacity to implement No Child Left Behind reforms. That's right. The study could not conclusively link the center's activities to any measurable improvements in educational outcomes or state-level implementation of federal policies. So with a finding like that, clearly the program was shuttered and the money was shuffled off to some other program that was producing positive results, right? Wrong. The Department of Education still finances this project to the tune of $50 million a year, which kind of gives credence to President Reagan's claim that the closest thing we will ever experience to eternal life on this planet is a government program. Now, let's be intellectually honest. Do the examples I just provided prove that educational studies are not worthwhile or that all studies conducted or funded by the Department of Education are worthless? Of course not. I'm sure there's a lot of good ones that made it in. But the real question is, why do we need a massive federal bureaucracy to fund studies? Especially studies which conclude that the work that the federal government is doing is not achieving the results that the federal government said they wanted. And here's another question. Why are all of us being forced to fund studies which, far from objectively looking at the data, seem to be selectively finding whatever data confirms their bias? So, if we truly want academically rigorous and useful studies, we need to acknowledge a few things. One, the government is not a neutral party. You probably won't be shocked to discover that government-funded studies tend to conclude that what's really needed to solve problems is more government power. Two, we need to understand that government funding does not mean objective conclusions. Along with concluding that more government power is needed, government-funded studies tend to conclude that more government-funded studies are needed. Do you think that's by coincidence, or do you think that's people trying to justify their next budget? Furthermore, can we all just acknowledge that all studies do include bias? And the best environment is one where we all understand the various motivations involved instead of treating government studies or government-funded studies as if they're somehow the pinnacle of objectivity. In short, do we need studies? Of course we do. But do we need the government to be the primary author or financier of those studies? Only if you want said studies to conclude that what is needed for every problem is more government.